Alright, this video is going to go over the access control list we will be implementing in the lab. And I'll also talk about some of the issues you may run into while you're trying to implement access control lists. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure a certain number of things work. One, from your browser on a PC, we're going to be working on VLAN 3 first. So from your VLAN 3 PC, you should be able to get to that website by HTTP and also by HTTPS. I like to clear the browser window because it's hard to tell if it actually works or not. Alright, so HTTPS worked by domain name. We also, for fun, we're going to want to ping the server. So ping is working. And we're also going to want to try to SSH to the server. Now in Packet Tracer, it's not, the server doesn't support SSH, so what we'll notice is how fast the refuse come back. So basically the host sent back a TCP reset. When it's being filtered, the behavior will be a little different. So we want to do that from VLAN 3, and then from the outside, I'm going to have a test workstation set up for you to test from. From the outside, you're going to want to ping the internal server, right? And you're also going to want to try to SSH to the internal server. And you'll notice I'm doing this by the NAT IP address we set up. So you still need the NAT we set up. And I'm also going to try a browser window to get there by IP address. I don't have DNS set up on the inside yet, and you don't have DNS set up on the inside yet because we're not doing that till next week. So that's the NAT I set up for the VLAN 3 web server, 99.5. You'll have a different IP address that you have set up for the thing. So that works for HTTP and HTTPS. So right now everything's working. And what we want to do is we want to break some things. We don't necessarily want all of these packets to be allowed in. If it's our web server, we only want to let web traffic in. So, sorry. So we're going to implement some access control lists. This is the same router config I had at the end of the last podcast I did. Your config might be a little cleaner than mine, but we're going to go with my config. I'm going to go with my config to show you what I want to do. So right now I don't have any access control list, so I'm going to create a extended access control list. I'm going to create a named access control list. I'm going to call it inbound from internet. Right, so this is going to be the list that's going to control what traffic is let into the network. So I'm going to create that. If you remember from the other podcast, this is how we create access lists in this little access list configuration dialog. I'm going to allow a TCP from any, right? On the outside, I need to let it into the NAT address, so I'm going to put the NAT address I'm using for that. Sorry, I need to put host. So I'm going to allow traffic from any to this particular host, and I'm going to let it to port 80, EQ80. I'm also going to let it to port 443. So right now, that's all I'm going to let into my web server initially. So hopefully you remember we need to apply it to an interface in a direction. I am filtering traffic from the internet, the simulated internet, so I'm going to put it on FA00 in the inbound direction. It's coming into the router. So to apply that into the interface, I put the IP access. I go to the interface config context, put in IP access group, then put the name of the list, inbound from internet, and I want it in the inbound direction. So now, if I go to my server and test some things, I should be able to get to. If I go out to the external client and test some things, I can get there over HTTP. I can get there over HTTPS. What about ping? Is ping going to work? I'm getting an error for ping, so ping is not working. And my SSH, it didn't work before, but you'll notice it's timing out longer. So before the traffic made it and my host replied with a reset, now my host didn't respond. So I actually blocked that traffic. So that access list is doing what it wanted. That's what we want to test. If we go on our router, and we run the command show IP access list or do show IP access list, it shows us our access list, and it also nicely enough shows us how many matches we had for those entries. So that can be helpful if you're troubleshooting and you have a list that you think should be matching, but then you come look at the list and it has 0 matches, then there's something not going right. So that was the outside. So now we also want to test from the inside. We want to, from the inside, try to get out to the web server. So we'll go by IP address for now. And it looks like it is not working. And the reason it is not working is because the return traffic is not being allowed. So I have the traffic going through this router out to the server, and then it's coming back to this router on this interface. It's trying to come in this router, and this router is looking at these 2 things it's allowing in. So it's not letting that return traffic in. So we're gonna go ahead and do a couple different things just so we can walk through some of the issues you might run into. We're gonna create a access list to let the traffic out of VLAN 3. We're gonna do that first because lots of firewalls, access list extended, outbound from VLAN 3. Lots of different firewalls. Once you let traffic out, it's smart enough to know that it wants to let it back in. Cisco router ACLs, maybe not so much. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to update our list to, we're going to create a new list, for traffic from VLAN 3. And for practice, we're going to go ahead and specify a network address and wildcard mask combination for our source. So basically, we're only going to let traffic out from our source network that matches our network. Some people might argue about the necessity of this. I mean, if you just have that network back there, does it matter if you filter for the network address and IPs in that network or not? I don't know. I'm not going to talk about that now. But we're going to do it for extra practice. We're simulating getting out to the internet, so we're going to let it out to any EQ80. So we're going to let anything out from our LAN over port 80, and we're also going to do 443. So that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to go apply the interface, apply it to the interface. In this case, we need to apply it to the 1/0.3 subinterface. Sorry, that was backwards. 0/1.3 subinterface, and IP access group outbound from VLAN 3, and we're going to apply that in the inbound direction. So this list is going to look at traffic that's coming into that subinterface. So now we're going to go try to connect, and well, you can never tell if it actually tried and failed or if it's still just the old thing. So that's why I like to get a new browser, a clear browser every time. So we look, it's still not working. So not only did that not fix the problem, but now we've actually created a new problem. Now if we go out here and try to go to the website, we've created a new problem. So now that's broken. So now what's happening is when this host tries to get out, the traffic's allowed out of this router, it gets to the server. When the return traffic comes back, it gets dropped by the router. Now when you have the server trying to come in over the browser, it gets in to the server, but the return traffic gets back, it's getting dropped by this sub interface. So we need to update both lists to allow that traffic back out. And the easiest, most effective way to do that is probably to permit TCP any. We'll just be a little bit lazy. And then there's this I'm in the sub interface. I need to go into the access list config. And the easiest way is to permit TCP any, and then we want to put established. The established keyword basically says, hey, if this is part of an established TCP session, go ahead and let it through. So I put that on the VLAN 3 access lists. So now if I test, going to 99.99.99.5, that works again. And if we try HTTPS, that works again. So now we need to see if this works. It still isn't going to work because we didn't modify that other list yet, right? So we try that. Hey, that still didn't work. So right now we've modified the access control list on this inside interface. It says let the return TCP traffic back out. So we need to do the same thing on this interface. It says, hey, let the return TCP traffic back in. So we call that, what the heck, do? So we call that inbound from internet. So we need to edit that access list, IP access list extended inbound from internet. So we're going to edit this list, and we're going to put in that same permit TCP any established. So that's going to let the return traffic back in. So now we're going to go test that. So now I'll put that line in the list to let the return traffic back in. So now should we get out to 100, 100, 100.2. And that is still not working. So what we'll do is we'll go look at our access list again to make sure we didn't mess something up. And then we'll look at our inbound from internet list, and wait a minute. I added a new entry to that list. Oh, but wait, hey, check it out. I put a lowercase I, and my list had a capital I. So yeah, you might make this error. Capital letters matter, spelling matters, and it did not tell me, hey, that's not what your list is called. It let me create a new list that had that line in there. So to review, I typed the wrong thing. I put a lowercase I instead of uppercase I, and it didn't do what I wanted. So I'm going to go back in and actually modify the correct list this time. And I'll verify that this time. So now I have my permit any established. So now, in theory, I should be able to get out to 100, 100, 100.2. So that's great. That worked. So I have my HTTP, HTTPS working both ways, which is great. However, we need something else outbound. In the outbound direction, we had DNS working earlier, www.cnt.lab. That worked earlier. It's not working by DNS now. So we need to add a rule to allow DNS out. So pretty much we have these rules. So we're going to add one to let DNS out. And that's going to be on the outbound from VLAN 3. So we're going to permit UDP. We're going to go ahead and specify our internal subnet again, just for practice, because practice with wildcard masks and network addresses is good. We're going to let it out to any for DNS, and we're going to let it out for the DNS port, which is 53. So that should let the DNS traffic out. So let's try this again. We tried again, and it's still not working. So if we go look at our access list, we can do, remember I said we can do show IP access list and see what's happening. If we look, I have 2 matches for my new list, so that means those requests are getting out. But we don't have anything on our other list to let that traffic back in. Remember, we had to let the traffic back in for TCP with this. So we need to do something similar for UDP, for that return traffic from the DNS server. So unfortunately, there's no UDP established, so we can't do that. So what we're going to want to do is the traffic is going to be coming from any source, right? We're going to send it out to any DNS server on the internet. It's going to be coming from port 53, right? And then we want to let the traffic back in to our network. So again, we'll define our network for practice. And then we're not going to worry about the destination port because it's going to be an ephemeral port. We could do greater than 1024, but we're not going to do that. We'll just let it back into any port. So that's going to let the UDP traffic back into this private address range. So let's go try that again. And it's still not working. So if we go look at our access list again, we look at our rule, hey, there was no matches on that rule. That's weird. Well, if you remember in the other podcast with the slides, I said NAT complicates things. At this point, the traffic is going to the public NAT address on the outside interface. So let me point at that while I'm talking. The traffic comes out. It gets natted by the router to the 99.99.99. Whatever address, goes to the server. The server replies to 99.99.99. Whatever address. I'll look at the address in a minute. The traffic gets back to the router. So the access control list is being processed before the NAT is unnatting. So we need to use whatever IP address we are using for the NAT. And if we do show run, then we can see that for VLAN 3, VLAN 3 matches list 2. List 2 uses outbound 2, so it's going to be 99.99.99.20. So, sorry. So we're going to go get rid of that other list. Remember, if we edit a list, we want to get rid of this entry, so we can do no 40, and now we can add a new list with the proper IP. So in this case, our NAT address for VLAN 3 is going to be 99.99.99.20. So if we add that rule, because that's the IP address the track will be coming back to, now we try it. Hey, check that out, it works. So if we go over here and look at our access control lists, we have this list where this rule is letting the traffic back into the NAT IP address we used for that VLAN, and we have one match. So another tricky thing about NAT, remember we set up the static NAT for this server for 99.5, right? So another thing you might not know yet is that NAT takes precedence over the dynamic NAT. So this traffic is going out. When this traffic goes out to the server, let's clear the sniffer and try that again. When this traffic's going out to the server, if we look at the NAT for that, it's getting the address 99.5. So if we go look at our config again, we have a NAT that says, hey, anything that's 10.1. Wait, not that. Anything, where's my list? Oh, there it is. Anything that's 10.1.1.128 with this mask should match list 2. List 2 should be used for outbound 2. Outbound 2 gives it 99.20. So this address matches that list, but since we have the static NAT, it takes precedence over the dynamic NAT. So if we need to let traffic back in for that DNS server, then we also need to let the traffic, that web server, then we also need to allow the DNS traffic back in to 5. So now if I go try from this machine, hey, now it's working. So that's the way we need to make DNS work. I mean, we could be very lazy and do something like this. We'll get rid of those two lists, and then we'll add one that says, you know what? Let's let DNS back in to any machine that asks for DNS. So now with that list, with that entry in our lists, they both should work. So what should you do? Should you be more specific? Well, it depends on what you're worried about. If you're trying to that's weird. Oh, I spelled it wrong. Whew, that was close. What should you do? If you're trying to be very, very, very secure, then yeah, you can write very, very, very specific rules. If you're trying to make sure you're doing, what is reasonable, then I think it's reasonable to let any DNS back in if you're letting any client get out for DNS. So a couple other things we haven't talked about yet. The SSH traffic, that would work just like these. If we wanted to allow SSH in or out, we would just do EQ22. We would need to be letting the established traffic back through any other lists. ICMP is something else we might want to do. ICMP is used for pinging. It's also used for other things like reporting other error messages. So if I try to ping 99.5, that's not working. So I need to go edit my inbound list. I don't even know which list I'm working on now. Yeah, I'm working on the inbound list. So we can do permit ICMP any. Say, hey, let's let any ICMP in to the network. And we can also specify which types we want to allow. So if we only wanted to allow pings in, we could put echo here, and that would let just the ping in. So we're just going to put any ICMP to make our lives a little bit easier right now. And we'll try to ping again. And hopefully by now you're realizing, hey, Rich, don't you need to allow the return traffic back out from that other access list? And I'll be like, oh, yes, I do need to allow that return traffic back out from that other access list. So now I'm going to go into my other access list. And it will not let me go up far enough. So IP access list extended, outbound from VLAN 3. And we want to permit ICMP any. So now that's working. Since I'm letting any ICMP on both of those access lists, this should work now too. You want to be very careful filtering ICMP because some ICMP is useful, right? Destination port unreachable messages are useful to our hosts. Time to live exceeded is useful for us to troubleshooting. So a lot of ICMP can be useful to us, and if you block too much of it, you might create problems. So that's pretty much what we needed to talk about for the list we want to create in the lab this week. We're going to let web traffic in. We're going to let web traffic out. We're also going to let DNS out. We need to let established connections back through, and we may need to let some return traffic back in if it's not making it back through. Next 2 weeks from now or whatever, when we do the DNS lab, you're going to have to modify your list to let your DNS server work. You're going to put DNS on a server down here, and you're going to need to connect to it from the outside. So you're going to have to modify your lists to make that work.